Good morning. Before I begin, I'd like to say a few words.
Don't forget the Bills. Go Bills.
Just a little about the schedule. This Wednesday, there will not be a class. And this Wednesday, there will not be a class, and likewise Sunday. Next Sunday, there won't be a class. But in 2 Sundays, we're going to have a class on shofar. I don't mean the guy who drives you. I mean, which reminds me to get the shofar. One of the reasons we blow the shofar in the month of Elul is to awaken people to do Teshuva. So it's appropriate that we begin with the sounding of the shofar. Last week, we concluded with a discussion of the 2 levels of Teshuva. The 2 levels that are referred to as Teshuva out of fear and Teshuva out of love. And I mentioned that the difference between the 2 in terms of the effects, that when you do Teshuva out of fear, you mitigate the sin. It goes from an intentional sin to one that is considered unintentional. So you get off the hook. You spare yourself any punishment and the consequences of your sin. But when you do Teshuva out of love, it not only mitigates the sin, not only does it remove the sin, it actually transforms it into a mitzvah. That every sin that you did, for which you do Teshuva out of love, you get credit as if you did a mitzvah. Now, I didn't explain the reason for that. What's the rationale for that? The rationale is, and this is taken from the Hasidic work, the Tanya, is that why would a person do Teshuva out of love? You're a sinner, you did something wrong, and all of a sudden you're in love with God? How does that make sense? So the answer is that, yes, that's exactly the point. When a person realizes God's greatness, he realizes God's compassion, he realizes God's love for us, he realizes what God gives us, he realizes that God is the source of everything, and he has a better understanding and appreciation for God, then all of a sudden you start to feel terrible that you distance yourself so much from God. And the more you feel distant, the more your passion grows. It's like a person who was estranged from a close relative, and after a while they start to think, this relative did so much for me, they have so much love for me, and it awakens within you a feeling of love that you never even had when you were not estranged. King David, in one of the Psalms, says, my soul thirsts for you in a land, a weary land, a desolate land. And then he goes on to say, I should see you in a place of holiness. And the Baal Shem Tov translated that King David was saying that I'm in a place of desolation. I'm so far from the center of spirituality, the center of holiness. If only I would have the same thirst and the same love I have for you, God, when I'm in a holy place as I have now that I'm not in a holy place. When a person realizes how far they have alienated themselves, how much distance they created between themselves and God, they're filled with a greater love and passion that they never had before, even when before they were alienated. So that means that the sin is actually the cause of their increased and enhanced love. That their love and passion, if the thing would have been normal, would have been moderate at best. Now that they realize how far they've strayed, it creates within them and awakens within them a thirst and a love that they never had before. So what was the reason? Let me just finish this thought. What's the reason that they have this love? It's the sin. The sin is the engine of the greater love for God. So the sin becomes a virtue, provided, of course, that it leads to doing tshuva out of love. Yes, what's your question?
I find that when I have love, I'm more connected in the mornings, and in the afternoon where I lose contact and I want the love and I can't get it, it eludes me.
Okay, there might be two reasons for that. One reason is, it says that daytime is a time of divine kindness. Abraham is the one who composed the morning prayer, because Abraham is identified with and personified love and kindness. So the daytime is a time when God shines his light on us. Just like it gets light physically, it gets light spiritually. So that's why you're more in tune with that light in the morning. The afternoon already, when the sun is going in the other direction, that's when the light is no longer, the love is no longer so pronounced. That may be one reason for it. The other reason ties in with what we just said. After a whole night, when you were not engaged in anything spiritual, yes, the soul leaves the body and goes into paradise, but consciously you're not involved in it. It's dark. And then you wake up refreshed, and you feel that I was so far from God this whole night, I didn't have a relationship, and now I can start a new relationship. So it makes sense. So a sin could turn into a mitzvah. And there's another point over here. Everyone talks about time travel. Could you travel back in time? And the answer is, yes, you can. And that's what Teshuva is. The only way you can actually travel back in time, imagine if we had the ability to travel back in time, what would we do? The first thing we would do is get rid of Hitler. We would try to get rid of all these tyrants that wreak such havoc on the world. But we can't do that. So far, I don't think there's any plan of going back in history, and then that would be the paradox. How do we, if we went back, we wouldn't be born if we went back, but that's not the issue here. The issue is, could you change the past? And the answer is, yes, through Teshuva, not only do you mitigate the sin, you could even transform it and turn it into something positive. Now, what gives you that power to transcend time? We are bound by time. Creation involves creation of time and space. There's no way we could change time. But God transcends time and space. God is not bound by time and space. When God looks at the expanse of history, he looks at it just the way we would look at a film, at a movie. We only see one frame at a time, but if you had all the frames in front of you, you could see the entire movie all at once. Well, God, in a similar way, he sees all of the expanse of time in one fell swoop. He sees the whole thing. So he's in the past, he's in the present, he's in the future. So if we could somehow connect to God's way of looking at things, if we could be in God's vision of the movie of time, we could also go back in time. You could see that you can rewind the reel and you can go back into the past. How do we connect to God? The answer is, we have it in our soul. Our soul is a part of God. So there's a part of us that transcends time. But we're not in touch with our soul. Teshuva means you're returning to the letters of God's name, which transcends time. So when you do Teshuva, you have the power to actually affect time of the past and even transform it into something positive. There's a letter that the Rabbi wrote to an author who referred to a passage in the Jerusalem Talmud and in the Midrash as well. And this is about where Teshuva comes from. What's the basis of Teshuva? And 4 entities were asked about what to do with a sinner: wisdom, prophecy, Torah, and God. What that means is that we're going to look at what are the effects of a sin and what can you do about a sin from 4 perspectives. The perspective of logic, wisdom. Rationally, does it make sense for a person to do tshuva? We're going to see that no, it doesn't make sense. Prophecy, same thing, even worse. Torah makes it a little better, that yes, there's some way out, but only God could give us the power of tshuva. And this is how it works. They asked wisdom, what should happen to a sinner? And it quoted a verse, the sinner shall be pursued by evil. I'm going to go back and explain it. Prophecy was asked, what do you think about a sinner? And it answered, the soul of the sinner shall die. These are all biblical verses. Then Torah was asked about a sinner. Let him bring a guilt offering, and he will be forgiven. Bring a sacrifice, he'll be forgiven. Then they asked God, the Holy One, blessed be He, was asked, and God's response was, let him do tshuva, and he will be forgiven. So what's going on over here? What's going on is you're learning about the effects of sin and how we have to relate to those effects and what we can do about them. So when you ask wisdom meaning logic, person sins. What is that? What happens when a person sins? The consequences are cause and effect. The punishment is not tit for tat. Human beings are like that. When someone hurts us and we get upset, we shouldn't, we'll hit them back. It's tit for tat. Rewards are tit for tat. But the truth is that when a person commits a crime, performs an act that is contrary to God's will, the punishment is automatic, is a cause and effect. The person accidentally takes a knife and cuts the finger. You're cutting some vegetable, and you cut your finger and it bleeds. And then you say, I'm sorry. Is that going to help? Will the bleeding stop because I said I'm sorry, I did it, it was a mistake? If someone else harms you and the person says, I'm sorry for harming you, the effects are there. It's automatic. It's cause and effect. So when you ask logic, what should happen when a person sins? The answer is, the evil shall pursue him. The negative energy that you created is going to pursue you, is going to affect you. There's no way out if you're dealing with logic. So logically, there's no way of correcting your mistakes. But then, there's a deeper explanation why nothing will help once you sin. Prophecy. Prophecy represents the connection that we have with God. That's what a prophet is. A prophet has a direct line. So every one of us has a direct line in our relationship with God. Some of us, when their direct line is very active, we become prophets. Most of us are not prophets, but we still have that line. So when you commit a sin, you're severing your lifeline with God. It's like a prophet who gets the message. In the middle of the message, he lowers his spiritual status, and he no longer gets the message. So when you talk about prophecy and your connection with God, where does your life come from? Your life comes from your lifeline with God. If we, God forbid, could sever that connection, we would die right away. So if you ask prophecy, what happens to a sinner? The answer is, not only will it cause you suffering because it's a consequence, but it'll sever your lifeline with God, and it'll cause you to perish. But the Torah is a Torah of kindness. So when you ask Torah, what should happen to a person who sins? Torah says, look, we understand that a sin is a terrible thing, but it's not really you who did the sin. It's the animal in you. It's the animal soul in you that did the sin. And the animal soul is superimposed on who we really are. So bring a sacrifice of an animal, which reminds you that God says, I understand you committed this crime, but it's really not you. As long as you recognize it's coming from the animal and you tame the animal, then God says you'll be forgiven. So that's how the sacrifices work. The point of the sacrifice of an animal was to remind every person that he or she has not just a godly soul, but we have an animal soul, and the animal soul is usually more dominant. But it's not the real us. We are beyond sin. And therefore, God says, I'll forgive you. So Torah is more compassionate and gives us a way out by recognizing that it's not us, it's the animal in us. Just mute everyone. But then they ask God himself. And God says, you can do tshuva. Why is that? Because from God's perspective, there's no such thing as a sin. Because it says in the book of Job, if you do something good, are you giving God anything? Does God need anything from you? If you sin, are you hurting God? It's like you go to a bad analogy, but I'll use it anyhow. You go to a person who's very athletic, and you punch him in the stomach. It doesn't bother him at all. You try to punch God. Is God going to be affected by it? If God is affected by our actions, God is in big trouble, not us. Because such a insignificant creature created out of nothing by God is not going to harm God by doing a sin. So then why do we not have to do sins? Why do we have to do the good things? Because God said so. But God himself doesn't need our mitzvahs. He doesn't care about our sins in the ultimate sense of it, because God is beyond. So if you connect to that aspect of God, your sins don't rate. So that's the trick. The trick is of tshuva, you're returning to God. You're connecting to that aspect of God that transcends, as I mentioned before, time and space, but also transcends sin and virtue. And therefore, a way of, maybe a better analogy is, you offended someone, and the person is very upset at you. But then you realize the person who was offended realizes, you know who the one who offended me? That person is my closest relative that I never knew I had. It's my long-lost brother. And all of a sudden, you don't care about being offended, because the love of your brother or of your sister, whoever it may be, is so powerful that nothing registers, nothing negative registers. That's why we're so forgiving of people who are close to us. And for the same action that someone else would do, we wouldn't be forgiving. Why is that? Because the closer you are to someone, the more you recognize how insignificant the affront was, the insult was, the harm was. So if by developing this loving relationship with God and recognizing God's true essence, that from his perspective, God says, your sins don't mean anything to me. But the catch to this is you have to return to God. You have to recognize God's role in your life. And you have to, as Eliyahu mentioned before the class, you have to fulfill the commandment in the Torah that you shall know today that God is God in the heavens above and the earth below. There is nothing else beside him. When you recognize that, then you're in good shape. So it erases all of your sins, and not only does it erase them, as we said before, it transforms them into mitzvahs. So if the question is asked, is it a rational thing that tshuva will help? According to this, no. It's not rational for tshuva to help. You have to reach a level that's beyond rationality, and that's God. And when you go beyond rationality, no rational argument against you will have any validity. In other words, in order for you to get this aspect of God, which transforms everything, you have to transform yourself, transform your consciousness. And when you do that, it has the power to transform everything. Teshuva works for everything. Maimonides quotes a Talmudic source that there's nothing in the world that stands in the way of teshuva. So even though teshuva is such a divine gift, nothing that you can do will be in the way of teshuva. And then Maimonides lists 24 things for which teshuva doesn't help. A few paragraphs after he says nothing stands in the way of teshuva, he lists 24 things where it doesn't help. But then he concludes these 24, and I'm going to list some of the 24. So these 24 things only don't work, the teshuva doesn't work, if you don't try hard enough. But if you try hard enough, nothing stands in the way of teshuva. What that means is that certain things that you do, God doesn't give you the inspiration to do teshuva. You're on your own. Normally, God gives us inspiration. The month of Elul in particular, the month in Elul, we discussed how the king is in the field, the king is accessible. He smiles to us. He winks at us. You know, I'm waiting for you to do teshuva. So that's an inspiration. And there are other times of the year as well where God inspires us to do teshuva. But that's a normal case. But in certain sins that a person does, God's inspiration is withheld. But does that mean you can't do teshuva? No, absolutely not. It just means that it's going to be more difficult. You're going to have to make a much greater effort. So let me list some of the 24 things. If you caused others to sin, not only did you sin yourself, but you caused others. So even if you want to change, you have to change the others as well. Your teshuva cannot be complete because you sinned, so you can make amends for what you did wrong, but you caused others to sin. You told others, you facilitated sins, commission of a sin by others. It's very hard to do teshuva for that because the other people didn't change necessarily. That's one example.
It's very hard to cause somebody else to do something because there's an element of free will.
Yeah, I was just thinking.
You can educate people wrongly, tell people that it's all right to do this. You can entice people. Actually read this yesterday. There's in the past weeks, about a person who goes out of his way to entice people to worship idols. That's something that happened. One of the first king of the kingdom of Israel, the breakaway kingdom from King Solomon's kingdom, was a man by the name of Jeroboam. And it says what his sin was, he sinned and he caused others to sin. And God communicated with him, telling him, do teshuva. And he says, I'm a lost cause because I caused others to sin as well. In other words, how are you going to change the others? Your influence, let's say people who are in the public arena, people who are on the radio or television, who are constantly preaching whatever their views are, and they preach views that are evil, and many people follow it. You have this today, what's going on with the anti-Semitism in the world. You have a few famous people who have the ears of 1 million or so people, and they're spouting all this anti-Semitic venom. And there are a lot of people who are just ignorant, and they just pick it up and they continue to spread it. So even if this person wants to do teshuva, it's going to be very hard because look what they did. Look at the damage they already did. It's true, everyone has free choice, but it's still, you aided in that person, you aided and abetted that person's sin. Another example, I'm not going to go through all 24, another example, if a person says, I'm going to sin, but I know the trick, I'll do teshuva afterwards. So I'll have my cake and eat it too. I'll do whatever I want, and then I'll repent, I'll do teshuva. So it says in the Mishnah, Maimonides codifies this, he will not be given the opportunity to do tshuva. Which means, again, and the Tanya emphasizes this, it means that if you're not going to get divine assistance to do tshuva, but if you push your way through, if you break the doors down, you'll be accepted. Even though the reason why the tshuva doesn't really work is because tshuva is the cause of the sin. You know, just like I mentioned before that your sin is the cause of you returning to God, is the cause of you to love God more, so the sin turns into a mitzvah. Here the mitzvah turns into a sin. If you didn't know you could do tshuva, you wouldn't have sinned. So what causes you to sin? Tshuva. So the tshuva itself becomes a negative. The Talmud uses an expression, not for this, but others apply the Talmudic expression to this, that a prosecutor cannot be a defender, unless you're in the Soviet Union. But the same lawyer who's the prosecutor says, okay, now that I'm going to be the defender, you can not trust that defense. Well, the same thing over here. If tshuva is supposed to be the defender, but if the tshuva is the prosecutor, the tshuva caused you to sin, again, because if you didn't have the ability to do tshuva, you would have been too frightened to sin. How could tshuva then become and defend you and save you? Same thing with a person who says, I'm going to sin, but Yom Kippur is coming. Yom Kippur is a day of atonement, and God will forgive me. You can't do that. You can't sin with the prospects of doing tshuva. But if you pushed your way through, you worked harder, without the support, the divine support, you could do tshuva even for that. Rambam gives, yeah.
So what happens if you do, say like you're a sinner, I don't know, you're a robber, you're a thief, whatever, you do something where you sin continuously, but then at the end, like you throw yourself in front of a speeding train to save a child or something like that. Mm-hmm. Does that count as tshuva? Or you kill somebody to save another human being?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't unless the sin was that you threw someone in front of a car, and you do tshuva by throwing yourself in front of the car. Then it's you're atoning for the sin by doing the opposite. But if you sin, you robbed a bank, and then you throw yourself in front and save someone, you'll get credit for saving someone, a lot of credit, but it doesn't take away from the sin. It has to be the same direction as the sin that you reverse with the tshuva. Another example he gives is a person who separates from the community. A person who sticks to himself and doesn't want to be part of the community, doesn't care about the community. So the person like that will not even know how to do tshuva. The person is going to be ignorant. In other words, when a person lives an ignorant, isolated life, they're going to commit sins without realizing it, and then they're not going to know how to do tshuva. They're not going to know how to correct it. And there were many other examples that Maimonides lists, too numerous to go into right now. I want to talk about Mashiach. Maimonides writes, and this is taken from the Talmud, whenever I quote Maimonides, by the way, it has to be borne in mind that 95% of what he writes in his major work, Mishnah Torah, is taken from the Talmud and other parts of rabbinic literature. Unless the Rambam says, it appears to me, which he does maybe a few hundred times out of tens of thousands of teachings. So if I quote Maimonides, unless I say otherwise, it's based on earlier sources. But even if it was just based on Maimonides, I would trust it. What does he say? That the coming of Mashiach, the final redemption, requires the people to do tshuva. People will do tshuva and they'll be redeemed. Many people take that to mean that Mashiach can't come unless we all become good people. But that's a misunderstanding of it. It doesn't mean that Mashiach can't come unless everyone in the world shapes up. Then Mashiach will not have any job to do because everyone will have perfected themselves without Mashiach. What it means is that Teshuva is the greatest catalyst for Mashiach's coming. The Rebbe said something very radical, that we have already done Teshuva. Well, how can you justify that? Because what do you mean by we? Who are we? When we say we, the Rebbe says we means the entirety of the Jewish people, but not just the entirety of the Jewish people living around today, the entirety of the Jewish people from the beginning of time, from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob onward, from Moses and the Jewish people who went through the Exodus and the giving of the Torah. From that point on, talking about 3,300 plus years, that's how we look at the Jewish people. It's one body, and it's not just one body of Jews who are alive, it's one body of all of the Jewish people. The Talmud has an expression, a community, a nation doesn't die. In other words, just because individuals pass away, we are still part of a very living nation. It's all of our history is one continuum, regardless of how many people perished and how many people are no longer physically here. We are here in our totality. And as a nation, we have done Teshuva. And even if someone will try to counter that by saying, well, statistically it may not be accurate, the Rebbe said all the suffering that the Jewish people went through cleansed all the negatives that have attached themselves to us. We have done, besides the good that we have done that is cumulative, unlike the evil that we do is not cumulative, the suffering and pain that the Jewish people endured, which is unparalleled by any nation on earth, and something that we can't even imagine how it's possible for people to have survived, up until and including the Holocaust, and tragically even beyond the Holocaust, October 7th, which is coming up soon. This means that the Jewish people as a whole have been cleansed and have done Teshuva. What about individuals? So the Rebbe gave an analogy. He said, you go to your doctor. I'm sure some people here have seen doctors in their lifetime. You go to a doctor, and the doctor checks everything, gives you an EKG, he checks your brain, he checks your kidneys, says, you're basically in good health. He says, doctor, I have pain in my back. Okay, you have some aches, take an aspirin, take a Tylenol, and the doctor will tell you how to treat the individual pains, but basically you're in good health. Not everyone, of course, and we wish everyone to have a speedy recovery, but a person who's basically healthy could still have aches and pains. The same thing is true with the Jewish people. We are a healthy people. The Rebbe had such a positive view of the Jewish people looking at them collectively. We are a positive, we are a good people, a holy people, a righteous people, a healthy, spiritually healthy people with aches and pains, individual aches and pains, and we have to deal with them, not to ignore them. So to say that there's an impediment for Mashiach because we haven't done Teshuva enough, the Rebbe says that's untenable. And also, one of the great pre-Holocaust Rebbes, known as the Munkacher Rebbe, said that God has to first redeem us, and then we will deal with all the sins that we have committed. Because if Mashiach has to come to correct every mistake that we've made and to change the world for the better, if we have already done it, we won't need Mashiach. Mashiach is going to be the one to finish the job, but we have started it and we have reached critical mass enough for the Mashiach to come.
Rabbi, if that's so, the Rabbi said this over 30 years ago. Why hasn't Mashiach come?
The Rebbe asked the same question. And the Rebbe said,
He must be wrong.
No, the Rebbe said that Mashiach's coming is inevitable because we're promised by the Torah, and Mashiach's coming is very close, and rationally it makes no sense that he hasn't come. In other words, there are a lot of things that God does that are not rational to us. But the Rebbe was trying to impress upon us that if you want to follow things rationally, you have to believe that God knows what he's doing. That's rational. And you have to believe that God will keep his promise and that Mashiach is going to have to come. And as he's coming is rationally speaking, should have happened already. It's like I take an object and I throw it out the window. What will a rational person say? Where is the cup going to go?
If you were
It's going to 1 second. It's going to fall to the ground. But
Rabbi could be wrong. He's not God.
the Rebbe is not. The Rebbe is quoting Torah. He's not quoting.
I'm talking about he should have come already.
Yes, but the Rebbe is a prophet, and a prophet is by definition can't be wrong because he's quoting God. So there's no question that, rationally speaking, Mashiach has to be here. And rationally speaking, based on everything that has happened to the Jewish people, especially after the Holocaust, it doesn't make any sense that Mashiach has not come. So but there are things that happen that are irrational, but a Jew has to think rationally. If you're not a rationalist, that's one thing, but if you're a rational person, you have to believe the Mashiach is imminent. And the only problem is, did we do enough tshuva? The answer is yes, as a whole we did. We just have to shape up as individuals, and that will accelerate Mashiach's coming. It'll make Mashiach's coming more palatable, we'll be more receptive to it. In other words, every mitzvah that we do, what effect does it have on Mashiach? Number one, it accelerates his coming. If for whatever reason Mashiach has to come tomorrow, by our actions he can make it happen today. Number two, the way Mashiach comes could come in two different ways. It can come in a very tragic way. It can come through pain and suffering, and it can come in a very beautiful, peaceful way. So every mitzvah we do has an effect on the manner in which Mashiach comes. The Rebbe, whenever he would speak about Mashiach, he would always add the words, it should happen b'chesed u'berachamim, with kindness and compassion. Why did he have to add those words? Because if you read in the Talmud and read in biblical sources, Mashiach's coming could come amidst turmoil, amidst war. There's a passage in the Talmud that one way Mashiach could come is that God will allow a country to elect a tyrant, a ruthless tyrant who will ban Jewish practice, who will torture Jews, and that will be the catalyst to bring Mashiach. We don't want that. That's not a guaranteed way of Mashiach coming. We want it to come in a peaceful and compassionate way. That's why every mitzvah we do helps that process become a positive process. And number three, and this is probably the most important one, Mashiach could come because of us or in spite of us. The Talmud has an expression, Mashiach could come when everyone is good or when everyone is evil. If everyone is good, it's because of us. If everyone is evil, it's in spite of us. Mashiach has to come to save the world. So every mitzvah you do tells God, bring Mashiach because of what I just did, not in spite of who I am and what I've done.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
how will we recognize Mashiach? What form will it take?
The Mashiach comes in different stages. The ultimate stage, if everyone doesn't recognize that he's not Mashiach. Someone once asked, a non-Jew asked a Jew, what happens if when your Mashiach comes, I don't recognize him as Mashiach? So the Jew said, then I won't recognize him either. If every person in the world doesn't recognize that Mashiach is here, then he's not here. He's not fully here. Because the Mashiach could be in a process. Mashiach's, Maimonides, I don't want to go into this more detail because that's not the subject, but Maimonides gives he tells you exactly the process of Mashiach coming. The Mashiach is a great Jewish leader steeped in Torah and steeped in its observance, who's going to repair the breaches in Jewish life, and he's going to fight the wars of God. They could be literal wars or spiritual wars, and he will defeat all the enemies around Israel. And once that happens, he will build the holy temple and gather all the Jews to Israel. Then we know for certain that he's Mashiach. If at that point someone still doubts it, it would be very highly unlikely. Where all the enemies, Hamas and all their cohorts, would be eliminated, and there'd be no more anti-Semitism, and we'd build a Beis HaMikdash, and the Arabs would say, great, It's wonderful. They wouldn't oppose it, and he gathers all the Jews in the whole world and brings them to Israel, then no one's going to doubt it at that point. Going back to the original question, if tshuva means we have to change, what about someone who says, I've tried to change, but I can't change. I can't change who I am. So the answer to that is that there's another approach. Yes, the ideal is to change, especially as we get closer to the Messianic age. The ideal, the objective is to change our personalities, our mindset, our way of thinking, and our behavioral, not just behavior. But one of the things that creates the same effect, you could say, as tshuva, and in a sense it's a form of tshuva. It's called in Aramaic, it's a term coming from the Zohar, iskafiya or iskafiya, which means suppression. That in Judaism, every time a person suppresses his or her will, you want to do something improper, you have a desire to do it, and you say, no, I'm not going to do it, that generates, the Zohar says, such a powerful spiritual light that it's a light that transcends all the different levels of spirituality just by one act of suppressing your desire. So even a person who says, I have these negative desires to do things that are improper, or I don't have the desire to do things that are proper, and you suppress your will, that has a tremendous effect. So even a person who says, I can't change, I'm not going to change, you don't have to necessarily change, you have to just break your will. The Hebrew term for self-sacrifice is called mesirat nefesh, and usually it's translated as martyrdom, that a Jew would give his life for God, not to betray belief in one God. But the actual translation of the word mesirat nefesh, one of the translations, is giving of your will. You want to do A, and God says, I want you to do B, and you suppress your will for A and you do B. That is what we mean by iskafiya. And that's a perennial struggle that most people have to endure their whole life. The Tanya, the classic work of Hasidic thought, the very basis of it is that the ideal person is the Beinoni, the in-between person. What does it mean to be in between? The tzaddik is the ideal person. The tzaddik is someone who has changed his personality or has never had always a positive personality and therefore does everything right. That's very few of people like that in that category. Then there's the Rasha, the one who loses battles and allows the evil impulse to control him or her to one degree or another. Then there's the Beinoni, it's the one who's constantly struggling, just like the Rasha, but always manages to win the battles. Never changes. Every day he wakes up or she wakes up with the same negative desires, but they control it. And that, in a certain sense, is more important than the one who becomes the tzaddik, who was able to transform his or her personality totally. I think I told the story once before, I'll tell it again. The Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, had a Jew who used to come to his town, and the Jew would spend some time and he was inspired and he was doing the right things, and then he would leave for a little while and engage in less than moral behavior. And when he would come back to the Alter Rebbe was very friendly to him and very, very positive and embraced him. And then it happened again, a second time, and a third time, and a fourth time. And each time this sinner would come back, would have a change of heart temporarily. The Alter Rebbe was extremely warm to him. Some of the Hasidim couldn't take that. They said, Rebbe, this guy is never going to change. He's a perennial sinner. So why are you so loving to him? He's not a nice guy. So the Alter Rebbe says, you can't imagine the pleasure God receives when a person does one sin less. In other words, if you're planning to do 1,000,000 sins, but you decide one day I'm going to do 1,000,000 minus one, God is thrilled by that. Every little act that a person does, that's because this is the most powerful response to most people's aversion to change when they say, why should I bother changing? Because I know I'm going to go back. I'm going to revert to my bad habits. We make resolutions and we keep them for a little while and then we go back to our bad habits. Should we not make those resolutions? Absolutely not. We should not make those resolutions. We should make those resolutions because even if it works for a day, it's better than not working at all. Don't be satisfied with that. Don't be content with that. Work to have the resolutions last even longer, and ultimately to even change your personality. What about a person whose personality is so good and so positive, but if they put limits on themselves, then they need to overcome those limits? So even the tzaddik, who's perfect, relatively speaking, nothing is perfect in existence except for God, but even the one who's relatively perfect has a certain limit to how perfect they are. They have to try to go beyond that. They're not content. They don't rest on their laurels. The next level, the higher level, may not be the most significant level, but the higher level is where you're totally transformed. Now, how does a person transform himself? This is the most difficult thing. How do you really change? So I list over here 5 different methods. One method is when a Jew, and this happened throughout history, is put to the test. He's being asked to convert to another religion. And this happened in the medieval period thousands of times. But Jews were told, either you convert to Christianity or we will kill you. During the Crusades it happened. And the Jew is prepared to die for his or her religion. That means that a part of your soul, the essence of your soul, was revealed. And that can transform a person. That's an extremely traumatic experience. And when you experience something traumatic, it can change your personality. There are people throughout history, not just the Jewish people, but the people who went through trauma, and the trauma just changed, it just jolted them into becoming a different kind of person. People who go through life-threatening surgery or life-threatening situations can change, but you can't plan those. Those things happen to you, they're not things that you could plan. And the logic behind it, why it changes, is because the soul has 5 different levels, and we spoke about this many times. I'm not going to go through it in detail. When the highest level of the soul is revealed, it affects all the other levels. And that's the level of Yechida, which is revealed in certain times, like Yom Kippur, the 5th of the 5 prayers of Yom Kippur, is when that part of our soul is closer to becoming revealed. Okay, that's, again, something that you can't plan Yom Kippur every day. It happens once a year. Method 2 is called Moech Shalit al Halev. It's a phrase that the Tanya quotes, that by nature a human being's mind controls his heart. That if you really work on meditating intensely on a subject, and you keep on doing this, repeating it over and over and over again, you can have your mind control your heart, that your heart itself becomes different. Heart meaning your emotions, your feelings. The famous story of one of the followers of the Alter Rebbe, his name was Moshe Meisels. He was a linguist, and when Napoleon entered Russia, the Alter Rebbe was on the side of the Tsar, not on the side of Napoleon. That was a big dispute amongst Hasidic leaders, which was a subject for another time. And he dispatched this Moshe Meisels to get a job for Napoleon's higher command to translate documents from Russian into French. So he's sitting in the high command with generals, and he's doing his translation, and Napoleon walks in. And he sees a Jew with a beard. He sees he's a chassid sitting there, and immediately he suspected him of being a spy, because France was losing some battles, whatever it was, and there was investigation of what happened. And he runs over to Moshe Meisel's and he puts his hand on his heart. He says, "You're a spy." And Moshe Meizel was able to control his heartbeat. And he says, "I owe this to my Rebbe because he taught me how to control my heart, literally my heart, not just figuratively." And that saved his life. But Napoleon threw him out. He didn't let him stay there, but he spared his life. Method 3. I'm going to give an example. Ibn Ezra, one of the great Bible commentators, lived close to 1,000 years ago. He comments on the commandment, the 10th commandment of the so-called 10 commandments: don't covet, don't desire something that isn't yours. How does a person control your desires? If I see something that my neighbor has, a beautiful new car, and I desire it, how could I control myself? I won't steal it, that I could control. But how could I control my emotions? So the Ibn Ezra says, would a peasant desire to marry the princess? The peasant doesn't even harbor such a desire because he knows it's totally out of his league. There's no chance that the king will decide to marry off his daughter to this peasant, this illiterate, peasant. So he doesn't even have the desire. Another example he gives: does a normal person have a desire to have relations with his mother? Why not? She's a beautiful woman, and everyone else would want to be with her. But it's off limits. Once you know something is off limits, you realize it's not for you. And the same thing is true. If a person recognizes that things that you desire are off limits, they're not for you. You have to keep on repeating it to yourself and meditating on it. You will come to not desire and covet something that isn't yours.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Yeah. So I've always been a little confused about that. Like, let's say, my neighbor has a new car, and I'd like a new car, but I look at it to say, I'm super happy for them. I don't in any way wish they didn't have it or that I had that specific car.
Okay, then you're not in violation.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, someone will buy a book that I don't have, and I look at the book. He says, "Oh, I'd like that book also." So if I snatch it from the other guy, or I say, "Could you give me that book, please? I need it," that's a violation.
Okay.
But if you go to the store and buy the same book, that's not a violation. Method 3 is by revealing our inner goodness, by revealing our inner soul. Maimonides discusses a case where a person is required to give a get, a divorce, to his wife by Jewish law. In certain cases where the husband is abusive or whatever, and the Jewish courts say, you must give your wife a get, and he refuses. It's a problem because the get has to be voluntary. But he says, no, I absolutely refuse. And the courts could authorize him to be lashed until he says, okay, I agree to give the get. And the get is kosher. So Maimonides asked, it doesn't make sense. If the Torah requires consent to give a get, what kind of consent is that if you beat him? And the Rambam, Maimonides, says something very powerful. You would expect to find this in a Hasidic text, but he says this, that the truth is that every Jew wants to do every mitzvah. That's the innate, inherent nature of every Jew. It's your yetzer hara, your evil impulse, or maybe we can use the term the animal that we spoke about before, who covers up what you really want. So by beating the person, you're revealing what his real desire is. So maybe consciously he says, no, I don't want to give it, but unconsciously he does want to give it, and now that it came out into the open, that's his true will. And that's why if someone beat him without the consent of the court, the get is not valid, because it's not God's will. If it's not God's will, it's not his will. It's not his inner will. Want to continue, or should we leave this for another class? Continue. we have to recognize that the sin and the sinner are two separate entities. We are not defined by our sins, because that's not who we really are. That's an innovation, you could say. It's based on Maimonides, but it's something that Hasidic philosophy emphasizes over and over again, that the sin is not, and it's based on a passage in the Talmud. Rabbi Meir was a great sage, and he had neighbors who were terrible people and were harassing him, so he prayed that they should die. And his wife, Bruria, who was known to be a brilliant woman, says to him, what you're doing is wrong. It says in Psalms, may the sins cease. Don't pray that they die, pray that they cease sinning. And he did that, and they became good people. What does that tell you? That we don't identify the sinner with the sinner's sins. They're two separate things. One is imposed on you. So if you can reach to who you really are, then you could change. The story is told, the true story about this chassid who was involved in business. Now he would, as a chassid, he dressed in Hasidic garb, whatever that meant in those days in the 19th century. But when he went into do business dealings with the Gentiles, he would dress in the modern attire, whatever was modern in those days. And whenever he would come to visit his Rebbe, I think it was the fourth Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shmuel, he would dress the Hasidic garb. And then he said to himself, you know what, why am I fooling my Rebbe? I don't dress like that all the time. I dress in modern apparel. So I'm going to dress in the modern apparel when I come to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe looks at him when he comes and he says, why are you dressed this way? He says, because this is how I dress when I go to do business. So the Rebbe says to him, I thought that the real you is the way you are when you come here. And when you do business, that's not the real you. Now you're telling me that that's the real you? So we have to decide what's the real us. And Teshuva, as we said before, means returning to the real person, who we really are. Method 4 is behavioral. You could change your personality through behavior. Yes, if you do something once or twice, it's not going to change your behavior, change your personality. But if it's repeated over and over again, then it will have an effect on your personality as well. And there's a famous story of the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, and the miser. There was a Jewish family that was taken captive because they didn't pay their rent, the landowner, and thrown into a dungeon, and he demanded that in order for him to be released, for the family to be released, they had to pay this huge ransom, which included the rent that he was in arrears. So the Alter Rebbe, together with his colleagues, were drawing up a list of people to go to collect money to save this family. And they made a list, and the Alter Rebbe says, but I see there's one name missing. The wealthiest Jew in town is missing on this list. And they said, we're not going to waste our time. He's a miser. He never gives anyone anything. Yes, he gives them a rusty coin, a nickel or whatever it was in those days. And people just throw it back at him. And then people stop bothering even asking him because he's known as the miser. So the Alter Rebbe says, if you don't go to him first, I will not join you. So they say, we're wasting time. This family is languishing and their lives are in danger. Why should we waste time? The Alter Rebbe says, well, then you don't need me. So they go to this miser, and the Alter Rebbe knocks on the door. The man opens up, and he's surprised to see these venerable rabbis standing there. He says, what can I do for you? He says, we're collecting money. We need whatever is, let's say, 1,000 rubles, and we're hoping that you could help us. He says, sure, I'll be very happy. And he goes, and he takes out this rusty coin, and he gives it to the Alter Rebbe. And the other rabbis are rolling their eyes, why do we have to go through this exercise? And the Alter Rebbe says, thank you so much. He thanks him profusely. And he walks away. And the man says, come back. I'm going to give you more. And he gives him a ruble. And the Alter Rebbe thanks him again profusely. And he leaves. The end of the story was he paid the full amount. And the Alter Rebbe explained, this man had real kindness in his heart. But when he gave the first time, he gave the rusty coin. It wasn't rusty, and people didn't accept it. And then he kept on giving that coin and throwing it away. He never had a chance to exercise his kindness, to express his kindness. By virtue of his behavior, when he was able to give more, that opened up the well of kindness in him. I would add that I think the Alter Rebbe's presence also had an effect on him. And the fifth method is, if you want to change your mindset, it's through Torah study. Because Torah is the blueprint of creation. So if you keep on studying what the Torah says about things, it'll affect your way of thinking. It'll change your mindset. And little by little, you'll start thinking differently. I know a lot of people who had very secular ideas, and when they started studying Torah, after a while, their whole way of thinking changed. And that's why the Rebbe said one way of preparing for Mashiach is by studying the Torah, particularly the subjects of Torah that deal with redemption, because our minds are exile. We have an exile mentality. That's the natural state of where when we're in exile, it affects us. It imposes its mindset on us. So if you want to change your mindset, you learn Torah in general, and especially the parts of Torah that deal with redemption, so it opens up your mind to think in a redemptive way. Pessimism is an exile condition. Optimism is a redemptive approach. Seeing the negative in everything is exile. Seeing the positive in everything is redemptive. So if you keep on studying the Torah about positive things, it will change your mindset.